Hey everyone, my name is Justin Shelf. I'm the founder here at PatchMyPC, and this is our second video in the series Learn with PatchMyPC. In this video, we're going to be digging into the software update point components in ConfigMgr and how they interact with WSUS. So I'll let the team do quick intros from top left to right.
Yeah, so Cody Mathis.
Jake, one of the support engineers here.
Jordan Menzing.
Wes Mitchell, one of the support engineers.
Adam Cook, support engineer.
Andrew Jimenez.
Cool, awesome. So let's get started. So first thing to note out is we do have accompanying blogs for these video guides. Generally speaking, it will probably work best to go both the video and the documentation to get better context about what we're talking about in the doc. But we do have this accompanying post. You'll see things like log file snippets, things that's happening. So just be aware, if you go to learn.patchmypc.com, it's going to be the Understanding How ConfigMgr Interacts with WSUS guide. So with that said, we'll go ahead and get started. So mainly it's going to be myself, Cody, and Jordan kind of doing the demo throughout this presentation. So to get started, the first thing we're going to look at is what actually happens when you install a software update point. What are the different threads involved for the executive service for ConfigMgr, for the installation, as well as the configuration of a software update point. So if we take a quick look, and one thing to call out, we do have a couple of different labs that we'll be moving through. So one thing, we'll try to mention this as we move to a different scenario, but these will correspond to the blog post for each scenario. So for example, this will be the first one on demo 1, and we'll call that out on the blog post for each scenario that we look at. So in the first scenario, what we have is we have a ConfigMan site. It's just a standalone primary and everything is installed on the site server. We currently do not have any software update point site system role installed, but we have configured WSUS. So if we go and look at Server Manager, that's pretty much the first step that you would have to do before you install the SUP. You would want to install WSUS. You don't really have to go through any configurations to it. But that would be step one. We're not going to cover that, but I will link in a video that just covers walking through the WSUS configuration, which is pretty basic. So next thing we're going to do is just right click and add a site system role. We're going to include this on the site server. So just to keep things simple, we'll include it there. Just move this over. Do next here. Next here. And then we're just going to choose the software update point.
I now know why your taskbar is always on the side of the screen.
Yep. Yeah, so doesn't always fit all the ConfigMgr windows at the resolution that we're on.
Okay.
So not a whole lot here. If you're using anything Server 2012 or newer, it defaults to the 8530 and 8531 rather than 80 and 443. So generally speaking, this will probably be the correct port unless you configured anything non-default when you install WSUS to put on the default website. So pretty basic stuff here. No connection account is needed. One thing to note out is that if your WSUS server is remote from the site server, you would want to make sure the computer account of your site server has administrative access on that remote machine in order for it to connect and be able to install the different components to connect into WSUS as well as install the software update point components.
One quick question too, on the software update point section, if you're configuring this for the first time, would you recommend setting up the SSL portion of this right away if you have what it takes to get that configured?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if you, if this was a first time setup and you did want to use SSL for WSUS in your software update point, I don't see why you wouldn't do that right from the beginning. That would probably be the best way to go, rather than having to do it retroactively. Either way is fine though, and we'll include a link to a recent guide that we did on how to switch a WSUS server to SSL. But yeah, I mean, if you're doing it for the first time, I don't know why you wouldn't do it to begin with.
One thing that is interesting about the ports too, it's called out in the docs, but typically you see 8531 and then 8530 and then 80 and 443. So if you do SSL, you actually don't get to select the HTTP port So for example, 8531 and 8530, you get to select 8531. If you want, technically. The HTTP port is always the SSL port -1, unless it's 80 and 443. That's the only combination. So otherwise, if you, for example, selected port 9000 for HTTPS, the default HTTP is going to be 8999, and that's not configurable. It's always the SSL port -1.
And the one
Yeah.
other important thing to keep in the back of your mind too there is that when you are configuring SSL, while the majority of traffic and content goes over SSL, you will still get downloads and other components of it for certain components downloads via HTTP traffic. It does not send all of the traffic over SSL. It's not all HTTPS.
Yep, you will always need HTTP to WSUS. And one of the gotchas that I've seen sometimes is, crossing firewalls, right? Like maybe they've got a SUP in the DMZ or something, and they want to be able to move that content. You still need 8530 open, and that can kind of be a cringe point for some security teams, but it's ultimately a constraint of WSUS.
Yep, and more info on the SSL guide. We do have a doc in the video as well that points out to a pretty good kind of Microsoft guide, which will cover which one of those directories do require SSL, as well as which ones would not. So some good resources here as well. All right, so sync from Microsoft, that's going to be what you would want to use in almost all scenarios, with the exception if you're installing things like a secondary software update point, or if you had some weird scenario where maybe your machine didn't have access to the internet and you had some upstream one that did. Other than that, this is going to be generally what you want, which would be sync from Microsoft Update. So that's going to be configuring WSUS to sync directly from the internet in the Windows Update catalog. We'll just do sync on a schedule every 1 day. Supersedence, we'll talk about this a little bit further down when we start talking about the cleanup operations. WSUS maintenance, this is one that we would definitely recommend just based on our customer experience. This will just make sure that superseded updates get declined so that your clients don't scan against it. It helps with things like scan performance, as well as making sure that updates can publish if you're doing third-party patches. So these options will generally give you much better performance, and you can now enable that right in the setup wizard. Okay, max runtime, anything to call out here? I know they did bump this up so it works in most situations. Anything unique, or this should work generally without changing it, yeah?
There's a recent change. I don't know if it's in production, but it's definitely in a TP where there's an additional max runtime for non-feature updates too, right? That would end up applying to third-party updates, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So it must just not be in.
This.
Go ahead.
The big thing about this, though, in general about runtime, right, is it factors in if you're the majority of the time it factors in if you're doing maintenance windows, or depending on if you have an update that runs past it, could fail even if it's successfully actually installed. That's the other big thing to think about for that, because if you have a runtime that's larger than a maintenance window, it won't run. That's the big thing to keep in mind about these.
Yeah. We'll do full updates. Optionally, if you did like Delta and Express, this could be an option, but for the case of getting it installed and what we're doing today, won't worry about that. 3 classifications is what we'll do for the demo. This will just depend on your use case. And then products. So this is something that I do want to call out. I see this question quite a bit actually when people go through a first-time setup and they're like, hey, I don't see any of the products that I need, right? So Windows 10 isn't here, any of the newer Windows servers. So the reason for that is when you go and install WSUS for the first time, you don't actually go directly in WSUS and start running your initial sync, which would pull up the categories. So for example, the configuration wizard, if you're using WSUS standalone, generally you would go through and kind of configure which categories that you want. But since this hasn't gone through the initial setup, I'll just try to get to this screen. So ConfigMgr will actually trigger the first synchronization to pull down all the available categories, which is what would generally happen in WSUS if you were going through and clicking this screen. So if we actually go and look at the products directly in WSUS, since it hasn't done the first sync, it's going to be very limited to what comes in the database by default. But that's okay. We'll see things populate after the initial sync. So don't worry about that. This will come in once the SUP is set up and once WSUS has pulled the initial categories from the Windows Update catalog.
I'm actually curious, when you finish this, can you go over to where you typically configure max runtime? So there is a new setting for non-feature updates. I'm curious if they just didn't present it in the SUP setup UI.
Yeah, that could be the case. Okay, so it just kicked off the install, so we'll come back to the install piece. Is that in the SUP properties?
Okay. I think so, yeah. There should be a maximum runtime section. Okay, that's interesting.
Might be on a newer build. This is 2010.
2103.
Yeah.
2103.
So we're not there. Okay. Yeah, I think we're on 2010. All right, so once the SUP was set up, so once we went through that wizard, what actually happens next is the Site Component Manager kicks in. So Site Component Manager, it's actually a service. It's its own service, so it runs independent of the SMS executive service. So if we go and look at the executive, we can also see the Site Component Manager. So this is not an individual thread running under the executive. This is actually its own service directly installed on the site server. So when that kicks in, what's going to happen is it's going to determine what needs to happen. So if we go and search for WSUS in this log, we can see things like it's installing the WSUS control manager. What I'm looking for here is we'll see the actual command line. So this is where it called the role setup, and then SMS WSUS is the command line parameter that it uses to install the actual software update point component, which is going to be how ConfigMgr can interact directly with WSUS to make changes like categories that you select in the console to actually go and sync with WSUS. So that's kind of the first thing. If this was a remote server, you'd have to make sure it has local admin. Otherwise, this would be where you could troubleshoot the installation failure of a software update point. So once that's done, kind of the next thing that would come into play. In our case, since we're on the site server, everything's going to be here. If your software update point was remote, these logs that we're looking at this point would mostly, or the WSUS control, I believe, would be on the remote SUP. So this is what's going to check whether the components for the software update point can find a valid version of WSUS and that it meets the version that it supports. So for example, I know that these 2 KBs, I believe, had to do with adding support for Windows 10 feature updates for Windows 10, I believe. So that's the first thing, make sure that it can see it. And then the bigger piece is the WSUS control manager component. So this is a thread that runs under the executive service on the site server. So one thing to note is if your site server, even if that's not your software update point, you do need to have the API piece for WSUS installed as well. Any thoughts on that, Cody?
So the only thing that comes to mind offhand is that technically you have to have a matching OS version, which would end up being a matching API version, right? So you could actually see found supported assembly. I've seen a lot of customers have done it with mismatched versions. I've also ran environments with mismatched versions. Works, yeah, but it's going to be something that Microsoft support might call out, right? Maybe you have your server on 2019, your site server, and then you have a remote SUP on 2012 R2. You'll actually see in the log it calls out a mismatch.
Yep. Another thing worth noting there is in that log file that you're running, looks like you've got SQL tracing turned on, just as something to be aware of if people are reading that log. It looks like you've got SQL tracing turned on in that log.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So you wouldn't see all that.
Yeah, I don't think I did mention that. But one thing that we did do is enable verbose and debug logging on the components that we're looking at today, as well as SQL tracing. So we'll link out to a video that we did previously that covers enabling that, just in case you did want to get the additional logging. So just be aware if you're looking at some of the logs that we have posted in our accompanying blog post over here, you might not see the same level of detail if you don't have verbose logging enabled, as well as SQL tracing. But the component that we're about to look at, this is on the site server. So this is going to be where the site server reaches out to the software update point. So in our case, it's both on the same one, but this would happen even if it's remote. It would go and configure the actual WSUS server, and that connection would take place from the site server. So for example, we can see that once we installed that, we can see that it went and it started to connect. But the piece that we're looking at to make sure it was successful, let's see if we can find that in the blog post. So subscribing to categories. So this could be an interesting piece to look. And then we have configuration successful. So if I go look at configuration successful, oh, let's see, might be an extra space in there. Uh-oh. Success. There we go. So successfully connected. So you can validate that it was able to talk to the WSUS server and it had the correct permissions. And one log file that I forgot to mention that we did have called out is the SUP setup. So this would be on the software update point that you installed. So in our case, it's going to also exist with all our site server logs, but in the event that it was remote, this would be on the remote software update point. So the SUP setup, you'll see that, and that's going to actually show ConfigMgr installing the component for the SUP. So here, for example, is that installing the prereqs and that SMS WSUS. That's the same command line that we saw pass from site comp. And then it just verifies it can connect to WSUS, and what we should see is successful. So that's going to make sure the software update point bits are installed and that it can interact with WSUS. So another good one if you had to troubleshoot any installation issues for a SUP. One other thing to note, like if you're not sure where these different component logs that we're looking at, like WCM, could be found, if you look under your site status and then if you click Start, you can open the Configuration Manager Service Manager utility. This one's kind of cool. So let's say, for example, we were looking at the component, the WCM, which is going to be what connects into our software update point from the site server. If you click Query, you can see whether or not it started. And then as well, if you click Logging, you can also see like where that log file is as well. So here's where that log is, just in case you weren't sure, as well as changing things like the max file size. One thing to note, we did adjust it from 2.5 meg to 25, just in case these logs, got pretty big and we were looking at them in the video.
I just noticed that use same log file for all selected components. I've never done that. Can you go to the component view? I'm actually curious what this does. Highlight like 3 of them or whatever. Can you, and right click and go to logging?
Huh. That's neat. So you could merge the logs together and kind of maybe scrape them into a logging tool. That would actually be
make them
kind of
massive.
neat.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would make the log file massive, but it'd be a single pane of glass if you were like exporting it out into some type of a log tool.
I wonder if it would affect like the existing log. Would it log to both, or would it only go to this merged one? I wonder.
I bet it just goes
just go to the merged one, I would think.
Yeah, we'll have to see if this is documented anywhere. Yeah, I haven't heard of this at all. It's odd.
It'd be a cool testing thing to try out too, just to see. Because if it does both, that'd be super cool.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so back up. So what we're going to do is if we click on our all software updates, we're going to see that we don't currently have anything in here. So after doing that first configuration, what's going to happen is we're going to have to wait till we actually have our first sync happen. So we had it set to run on a schedule. So what I'm going to do just to kick that off is we're going to synchronize our software update point just by going to the console. And what we're going to notice here is it's going to say wake up by local file here in a second in the Wsyncmgr.log. And this will be the component that actually interacts with WSUS, and it can see and monitor both the WSUS sync from Windows Update as well as the transferring of data from the WSUS database into the ConfigMgr software update point database, or the ConfigMan database for the updates view. So this one's actually pretty interesting. If you've been working with updates for a while, this is probably the most common log file that you'll see when you're going through and actually setting up and troubleshooting any type of sync issues. So the first thing that should happen here is it's going to go out and synchronize with Microsoft. So if we actually go and open the WSUS console, at this point it's triggering WSUS to sync with the catalog, and it's basically going to just wait for that to complete. So we can see that when we ran that sync, it basically went through and it configured the WSUS to start syncing from the Windows Update catalog. Once that process is done, and since this is the first time syncing, this will probably take 15-20 minutes or more to pull that in. So we'll pause it a little bit while we wait for this to sync, and then we'll come back and kind of show you things like the categories getting pulled down, the update syncing into the database, as well as some other data that's kind of interesting. All right, so this will take a couple minutes, so probably like 20 minutes to pull down the first sync. So what we're going to do is jump to one other scenario, and then we're going to come back to this. So if we look at the accompanying blog post, we're currently in scenario 1, installing the software update point. So we basically got up to the point where it's triggering the first sync right here. So once that sync is done, we'll come back and then we'll show how the categories got added. And then we'll come back into the software update point and actually show the additional categories now that our first synchronization completed. So we'll come back into here and we should see the full list of products within the categories that synchronize from WSUS. So we'll come back. What we'll do next is we'll actually talk about what a synchronization looks like when it starts pulling updates from WSUS into the ConfigMgr software update point into that database. So we're going to jump over from the scenario 1 VM, which would be demo 1, and then we're going to jump over to the scenario 2, which would be on demo 2. So what's actually happened here, if we look at our all software updates, we have some Microsoft updates that have synchronized in. Now, what we did on the back end is we synchronized our WSUS directly, which pulled in a lot of newer Microsoft updates. But we did not synchronize our software update point. So basically what's happening is the WSUS catalog on our WSUS server is newer. It has a lot of new Microsoft updates, but we haven't actually triggered a software update point, which is what would typically happen. It would sync both the WSUS server as well as the software update point. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and right click and choose to synchronize the software update point. And then what we're going to do is jump back into that Wsyncmgr.log. There we go. So we can see it just woke up. Okay. All right. So let me just go find the accompanying post. And one interesting thing, let's see if we can find this log line. If we look back up. So the first thing that it does is it runs some SQL queries. So let me just select one of these things that we can see here. And this would only be visible if you had SQL tracing enabled. So this is not going to be something that you see by default here. So I'll open SQL Server Management Studio. All right, so if I open up our ConfigMan database, so one of those things that we saw in that debug logging with SQL tracing is we can actually see a lot of these queries that are happening against the ConfigMgr database when a sync is occurring. So for example, when I go and copy this one and paste it, we can see that it's actually telling us what are the categories that we have enabled to actually sync from WSUS when it starts syncing to ConfigMgr's database. So for example, if I go into this lab, and if I look at my software update point and look at products, we'll see that this is going to correspond to the products that I have selected. So for example, if I scroll down, we could see like that Patch My PC one, we could see the Windows 10 one. So it's only going to sync whatever you have enabled. And at this verbose level, we can actually see a lot of this actually happening. One of the additional things that we note in the blog post is we can see it. Let's see. All right. There's probably like an extra space here. Try that. Oh, it's actually right here. So, it's going to go out and look at like how many SUPs are in our ConfigMgr site. So we can see it reading it from the site control file. Because one thing to note is that, if you have, let's say, 5 different software update points, and if they're not sharing databases, what actually happens is each one of those software update points are going to synchronize from the top level SUP. So for example, you have one SUP that syncs from Microsoft updates, and then let's say that you had, SUP 2, SUP 3. Once they basically go in order. So the first one syncs from the Windows Update catalog, then you would have SUP 2 that would kick off. You would have SUP 3, SUP 4, and SUP 5, and you can actually see each one of these synchronizing in this log file. So it's going to go read, how many SUPs are in the environment, and you can see all that happening with the verbose logging level here. Go. So here's kind of a log line, so we can see the sync is starting. So we can see it synchronizing the SMS database. So one thing to know, do you want to cover the piece about how WSUS and and the config manager piece are different, Jordan?
Yeah, I was gonna say this line right here is really important as kind of for something to understand. When you first start installing a software update point, the option that you're given there is you can right click and synchronize the software update point. That's actually calling two separate actions essentially. It's first calling an action for WSUS to synchronize with Microsoft and pull in all the updates based on products and categories that are checked, and then it's calling an action after that to synchronize that data over into the software update point. And I think Justin's actually highlighting here where you can see that was pulled in yesterday, right? That was pulled into the WSUS database yesterday, but we didn't allow it to actually come into Configuration Manager until just now when we started pulling the data into Configuration Manager because of how we have things configured. So these are two separate and distinct syncs. That's why if you look in our publisher service even, right, you can see that one is an action of publishing in data. It's the same logic where it publishes in data, and the actual action of pulling the data into Config Manager as well.
Yeah, and one interesting to note in this lab, we actually had it synchronized from Microsoft yesterday. Oh, what am I doing? And then we turned it off just to save some time for this video where it wouldn't pull directly from Microsoft for this video. But what would happen if I went in and set this to sync from Microsoft, and then if we went and triggered the software update point sync again, what we would see is it would then trigger WSUS to actually perform as sync, which is what we're seeing here. So the reason it's not showing up as today is just because we did change that setting to never sync from Windows Update. But as we're talking about this, I just noticed, hey, it might be good to actually see that as well. But it just takes a little bit longer for us to be able to complete the sync because it would go out, check from the catalog from the internet. But basically, jumping back to where we were, once it's done syncing from WSUS, that's when we start seeing a lot of actions take place in Config Manager. So, for example, we can see things like the categories and updates that need to be synced. And then kind of the next piece that I think would be interesting to look at is when it actually starts to sync an update. So if we do a quick search and just search for insert, this is where basically a new update existed in WSUS, and it had to insert it into the Config Manager database. So one thing that you might have remembered is when we first started this, we only had 3 updates in the database. But since there were newer updates from our WSUS sync that we did yesterday, it then determined that it needed to then import them into the Config Manager update database. And one thing to note, now that we did change that setting to sync from Microsoft and I triggered it, we can now see that it is performing step 1 of that, which is what Jordan was mentioning, is when you go and trigger that SUP, it actually goes and tells WSUS to sync from the internet. And it just so happens, we might actually be getting the Patch Tuesday updates from yesterday. I don't think this probably was there at 9:30 yesterday. So this might even take a little bit longer than normal because there are going to be new updates. But here's an example of it actually inserting, things like the updates into the database here. So you'll see a lot of these inserts taking place, and that's the only reason we see this in the log. Typically you wouldn't, is because we have SQL tracing enabled. So we can see what's actually happening where this component, Wsyncmgr, is actually inserting items into the database. Kind of last piece, so if we go ahead and look at let's look at processed. So here we can see that when that synchronization occurred for the config manager sync, which would be kind of the second one in that place, we can see that it synchronized 30 new updates. So if we go in and we look, we can see that we now have 33 updates, which really makes sense because we had the 3 originally, and then we had 30 new ones that got pulled from WSUS and the catalog sync that then had to be transferred into the config manager side of things. If we look now, this is going to be the second sync that I triggered, and we can see this first part is what's happening where WSUS is syncing from the Windows Update catalog. So you can see, 39% done. If we come back in and look at our sync and refresh, we can see that it's now at 48%. So periodically, the Wsyncmgr will query the sync status that's happening in WSUS, and we'll see some updates here as well. All right, and one thing to note, one thing that could be interesting to see how the updates get synced and where some data is stored is in the example we have an example query, but what I'll do is just because I know that this would be the same ID, if we go ahead and look at that Wsyncmgr.log, here's an example of one of the items that were inserted for the update. And what we can do is we can open SQL Management Studio, and basically I'm going to query that update identifier for the document from the CI document store. So this is where it was inserting that item, and we'll see some information about that update. And the piece that's kind of interesting is looking at the XML of the body, and this is where you can find different information about that update. So for example, we can see that this one, it's a Windows 10 update. You see things like the cab, the file size, the update ID. So let me see if I copy this real quick. So content ID, actually I'm not sure if that's content ID is different than the update ID, but things like the hash file. So, this is where it's going to validate when it downloads things like the hash. We can see the download URL for it. So just data that it's pulling from WSUS, this is where you can see those inserts happen and where some of that data exists in the config manager side of things. Let's jump back. All right, so we can actually see at this point the synchronization is completed from Windows Update for that second sync that we triggered off. So if we look at the bottom of the line, we can see that it did just finish up. It's 100%. And then what will happen is once WSUS has successfully synchronized from Windows Update, the Wsyncmgr component does do like a 2-minute sleep where it just kind of waits for, I guess, things to fully kick in. I'm not entirely sure why this happens. It actually didn't used to do this. It's one of the more recent builds they added this sleep operation in. But once that sleep is done for 2 minutes, that's when the config manager side, or that second sync that Jordan was talking about, will actually go and compare the changes that happened from the WSUS catalog that synced with Microsoft to the ConfigMan database. So we'll see this in a second kind of kick in. All right, so we can see the sync just completed. So this would actually be some items that we got from Patch Tuesday as well. So we can see it updated 48 items. So if we come in and refresh, we can see we were at 33 updates. And if I do a refresh now, we're at 57. So some of those would have been new updates, and some of those would have been updates that are now superseded. So it made quite a few edits, but we can now see the new Patch Tuesday updates that came out that are now showing up in the config manager side of things. Yep, so that I think is good for this portion. So let's jump back over to the scenario 1, and let's see whether or not we are still performing the first synchronization. So it looks like that's done. So let me just go up to the log lines that we have in our accompanying blog post, because one piece that's interesting is we should see the new categories that got imported. So here we can see things, this one might not be the one, but somewhere in this log, we'll see it actually importing the new categories that it found when it actually performed the update sync. So if we were to come back into our software update point now that the sync occurred from Microsoft, we should see all the available products that are now available. So here we go. We can see the list is now entirely populated, and that's because that first synchronization occurred. So that's, I think, scenario 1 and 2. Next up, we're going to look at scenario 3, which will be how the WSUS cleanup works within a site. So what we'll do is first we'll kind of jump in to make sure that you guys know where it's enabled. So we're going to jump back over to demo 2. Let's come over here. And it's basically that option as well that we saw when we went through scenario 1, where we went and enabled the WSUS cleanup. So these options will basically clean up the config manager database. Do you want to talk a bit more about decline and when that occurs, Cody or Jordan? Like when updates are superseded?
Yeah, sure. I don't care. You want to talk about it, Cody? Yeah, you talk about it, Cody.
A little bit anyway. Yeah, so the big thing here, he just showed it, the supersedence rules. So, ultimately these updates, Microsoft supersedes updates, we supersede updates, any vendor is going to generally do that. So this is configurable per site and for your SUP component, and it defaults to 3, which we have it set here to the default. So what's going to happen is every time your server does a sync, it's going to end up expiring updates according to this rule. So if the update was superseded and then 3 months passes, then it's going to be expired. And then additionally, if you have this checkbox checked, it will decline the expired updates at that point as well during the cleanup period. So if you have a very long period, for example, I've seen customers do 99 months, you're very likely going to have a large number of superseded updates still in your environment. They're not going to be expired. They're not going to get declined. Your total catalog size is just going to continue to increase. It kind of defeats the purpose of the decline expired updates feature.
And another interesting thing about that, like, is how expired really is considered, right? Because expired it's a config manager thing, right? It's a config manager component of the logic. It's not necessarily a WSUS component of the logic at that point. It's a tombstone record essentially that says after 7 days, once I've been expired, then I should go away. I don't know if we have any in here, but it's the little black X that would appear on the icon there, and that's a config manager piece, not a WSUS piece.
Yeah, good point, Jordan. What we can do, maybe just for an example. Now, typically, you're probably going to want to keep superseded updates maybe at least a month, 2 or 3, just depending on your scenario, because you do want to have time to test and still be able to deploy the previous month's update in a lot of cases. But just to show you what basically would happen, what we'll do, we'll say we want to immediately expire superseded updates and then choose OK. So what we'll do next is, so we can see that we have quite a few superseded updates here just from previous months. What I'm going to do is I'm going to perform a full synchronization of our software update point, because the cleanup would only occur when it's either a full sync or a sync when a schedule happens. So actually let's just do a full sync. So what I'm going to do is drop the full.syn file. So there's a couple of options here. So in order to do a full sync, which would fully sync WSUS and loop through every single update regardless of the time it's synced, you can do a full.syn. If you wanted to do a delta sync, which would be only updates that have changed since the last WSUS sync occurred, you can create a file called, is it delta.syn, right? Or is it? I think that's right.
It sounds right.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
So what I'm going to do is go ahead and drop that in. This is pretty similar to, so when we went and we said trigger software update point sync, which I think I just missed it because it scrolled, we saw it just said wake up by inbox drop. So if you were to go in and right click the sync updates, basically it does a delta.syn file, which would only be a delta sync. So what we're doing to force the cleanup to occur is we just did a full synchronization. So we'll pause it. This will take basically 120 seconds while it sleeps. One thing that you will note is that if I refresh this, if we look at the sync that occurred for patch Tuesday, it took about 4 minutes, right? So it would have picked up all the new updates that went out through the Windows Update catalog. But now that we ran another sync a couple minutes later, we can see that it didn't really detect anything changed from Microsoft updates. So that synchronization only took a couple seconds before we got to the period where it said it's going to sleep 2 minutes before ConfigMgr runs. All right, so we can see the synchronization just completed. So let's see if we can find the part where it starts cleaning up. So here we go. So once the sync is done, we can see right here. So it skipped a lot of updates just because there were no change. But this piece here is what's kind of interesting. So it said it removed 54 unreferenced updates. Let's see if we can find where the declining happens here. So there's where it adds the max runtime for any new updates. And here's where we go. So we can say it's cleaning up WSUS. So let's see if we can kind of break this down here. So cleaning up, indexing the database. So if those checkboxes that said add indexes, if they weren't there, you can see that taking place. And then this is going to be kind of the interesting piece where it says cleaned up, processed 57 total updates, and declined 27. So what happened When we went in and said we want to start removing superseded updates right away instead of 3 months, what's going to happen is when we do a refresh, we're going to see that these now are expired. So we can see that this is the X that Jordan was talking about. And that occurred because we made a change from 3 months to expire immediately when they become superseded. So the other piece that Jordan was talking about was after 7 days, we'll actually see these get removed. So we'll actually see, let me see if I can find it, where the stored procedure runs. Let me see, is it cleanup?
I'm not sure if it's in here.
I've seen it. I know I've seen it somewhere.
It has the word obsolete in it, doesn't it?
Yeah,
I think so.
Let's see.
To clean up or something like that.
Oh, it should be just before that. Scroll up past this.
Deletion
Yeah,
completed.
I don't know that it actually puts the sword. There it is. That's when it does it, but I don't see it actually running.
Delete update. I know I saw it. Let me look at the other log that we had here. I want to say I saw it like with the specific name of the stored procedure that we run. Let's see if I can find in this one. So it's called SP delete expired updates. Let's see if that pulls it up. Nope. Let's do delete. Maybe I just saw it deleting obsolete. But anyways, so what actually happens where we start seeing these X's is there's a stored procedure that runs. If we go look at the database, we'll look at stored procedures. And it's called SP delete expired update. So if I filter here, SP delete expired updates, this is the actual stored procedure that after 7 days will run and actually delete these red X or these black X's for expired updates from the ConfigMan database. Now, one thing that you can do, what do you think this would be a supported scenario running the stored procedure? Like it's using their method. It's questionable if you should do this.
Yeah.
But what happens is if you actually look at the stored procedure before I run this one, we can see it defaults to 7 days. So if we go and find, it's a parameter.
So it is a param, yeah. So 7 days is the default of what ConfigMan does. It's in the SCF, I believe. It's in the site control file. I mean, what I'll say is I'm not sure. I have ran it before. The main reason I will ever run it manually is if it is timing out within the ConfigMan cleanup process, right? Because at that point, I don't want to run 10 syncs over and over and over and over and let ConfigMan kill it. I'll just run it myself, and I'm not upset if it runs for a half hour.
The other thing that might be interesting would be to see if we can change the value in the SCF file.
You can,
because then you're not technically making the change to the database, right?
Yeah. Well,
and you could run it that way.
Yeah.
So if you run it manually, it doesn't time out.
True.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So what we're
at least not until you tell SQL to stop.
What we're essentially going to do here is say we want to run the stored procedure that deletes those updates from the config manager database once they've become expired, and we're just running it with 0 days instead of 7. So if I go and execute this, we can see that 54 updates were purged from the ConfigMan database. So if I come in and refresh, we're going to see these black X's for these updates are going to be completely gone now. All right, so we can see it deleted those 54 updates. And one interesting note is that in the last sync, we can also see that it updated, those 54 in the database, which would be where it essentially marked them as expired. Another thing to note is that stored procedure that we just saw run, it only runs based on a scheduled sync as well. So you wouldn't see these red X's get deleted until they've been expired for at least 7 days, as well as it's a scheduled sync that has occurred. And then that would be what essentially would clean them up, similar to what we did here, but we just set it to run right away.
And that's also when we would see that SP delete expired updates, that would appear in the log file at that SQL level logging on a scheduled sync. So that's why we couldn't find that in the log.
Yeah, exactly. So next up will be scenario 4. So this will be Jordan just kind of digging into the database, showing how on the ConfigMgr piece of things, how the scan data from our clients get reported back for just compliance data. So I'll hand it off to you. You should be able to do request control.
All right, cool. So a couple of things to know. Let's see if there we go. Cool. So a couple of things to know about Configuration Manager and reporting. There's a lot of different ways that you can report on the status of how an update works. You can report on everything from the status of a deployment to the status that an update actually returns back. I tend to build reports, and a lot of the reports that people build tend to be based off of reporting and with the data that gets reported back. But how do you interpret that? Because all the time, data from that is not always maybe as clear as what it should be. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I've got a little SQL query here I'm going to pull up, and this is available out on the blog as well. That we're putting out here is I'm going to throw this query here, and we're going to kind of walk through and step through this. So the first thing I want to bring up is what view should we actually use in order to determine patch compliance? So the first thing that I want to show here is well, what does this look like? So if we do select star from, and we throw this update compliance in here. There's a few different ones like this. We're going to cover 2 of those today, but what does this look like? Well, what comes back to us is we get a CIID, which if you remember from the SQL queries that we were seeing earlier, these CIIDs are the ID references that are getting inserted into the database and what track the relationship between this and an update ID in SQL, or in WSUS, I should say. We also get the resource ID. So the resource ID, if you're familiar with this, is the resource ID for the machine of this specific update with a status of 3, where the status indicates if it's installed, not installed, required, or various other possible options. And I'll go over how to determine that in a second here. We've also got the last time that status was checked and the last time that status was changed. But all of this data in this view like this isn't necessarily completely clean or easily to understand what it is. It's not 100% useful in this state. So what we can do is we can join it. Now, I just happen to know, so I use a case statement here of what those different status codes mean. We could instead pull, and I've done that down below, from the vState names view over here, and that's also referenced out on the blog post over there. And what this does would actually give us the definitions of those different state names. So if I was to just come over here and do this, you'll find a lot of the times in the configuration manager database that it just references a value, or just a number for a state of something. You'll see this a lot of the time as well, even in deployment information as well. Well, these are the determinations of what those states indicate coming back across here based on the topic. So the topic for software updates is typically 500 and 501, where 500 is for the state of if it's required or not, and 501 is the state of the scan. That's the state or the message that was sent back from when it scanned against the local files and then sent its compliance data back to WSUS as a result of that information. All right. We also have some other information. So I'm just going to go ahead and run this here and kind of walk through this now as kind of giving this little bit of data here. So what this actually then returns back to us, if I can get this to drag up here, there we go, is this now returns back to us the information like, is this patch, is this CIID compliant or not? And if the state is not compliant, to write not compliant and return the status as well as the resource ID or the machine that it's in that state for, along with the last status check time. And if the update, and then the actual state name as well, the true vanilla state name or the true meaning of the state name that Configuration Manager has behind the scenes. Now, the reason why I tend to use this view and why I would recommend looking at this view is because as you look here, you can see that this view or this view here, where I'm just doing some left outer joins on the data against compliance status, comes back with 196. There's another view that will return back even more data behind the scenes here. So I'm going to pull that up here real quick, and you'll see this be a common point of debate and discussion is which view should we use? and that is compliance status all. And if you actually type in b_gs update compliance status, you'll see this referenced here. Now, the tricky business with this is, again, just to kind of showcase this, we have down here in the bottom right, we can see that we have 196 rows. That means we have 196 compliance states for the number of machines that are in our environment. Okay. If we run it with the exact same number of machines in the environment, in this case, we get 4,824 rows worth of data. Keep in mind, this is a relatively small lab. So if we were to just do something like new query, and we did select distinct resource ID from b_r_system, right? We only have 6 machines. That means that if we query this view, we're getting 4,824 rows for just 6 machines for those software updates. This is one of the reasons why you want to trim down and keep your software updates to as generic or as clean as you can, because you can help reduce the amount of storage that you use and the amount of reporting that you need to report against as well in here. So this is also why a lot of the times when you're running a report, right, because this is just one piece of the data set, why those reports can take a long time, because it depends on which one. Now, what are you losing by using the update compliance versus the all one? Well, you're losing out on is you're losing out on this. You're losing out on being told that an update is not required, which you may or may not care about depending on your scenario. I want to showcase one or two more little things here. The first one that I kind of want to showcase here is how the logic for a software update group is tracked. So if we open up this, I've got another one here, and something that's kind of interesting here is that at the end of the day, a software update group is nothing more than a software update. Okay? Everything at the end of the day is pretty much, when it comes to software updates, becomes a software update in here. So we actually zoom in on this, we can see that we have, again, a CI ID that gets created for a software update group. These are just some software update groups that we have in our environment. And from there, we can then use a little more SQL to then track using relationship mapping to get what updates are in what update groups. So if I come here, I've got one more little query to show you. And then we'll go ahead and run this. And this actually then tracks, okay, so based on that CIID information of the software update group, because if you remember on the last page, we had the title of the software update group and then the CIID. So based on that relationship, these CIIDs of software update groups contain a relationship to these CIIDs for updates. So go ahead.
Something that could be interesting, actually. Do you want to go ahead and do select star from CI_types?
Yeah, absolutely.
So at the end of the day, too, not only is a software update group a software update is a CI, just like apps are associated with CIs. CIs are kind of the core for a lot of things. And we can actually see all of the things that are CIs by doing select star from CI types. And you actually see that CI type ID, right? So he was actually doing a very specific filter of a CI type ID. You can see that here, right? So a software update bundle is actually what a SUG is referred to in the database right there. Just like a software update is a CI type ID of 1. You've got baselines being 2, right? These are all things that are ultimately a CI. Now, something that is not a CI is a package. A task sequence, for example, is it's a type of CI that ends up having other components. So those are all in here. And they're just different types of CIs.
Yeah, and maybe even a more basic piece of that is CI is, referring to a configuration item. So, configurations, whether it's updates, SUGs, task sequences, from terminology, that's what CI, when we say that, what we're referring to.
Yep. So I'm going to open up one last thing here, which is this PowerBI report here. Just to kind of show how complex all those different data sets can get when you start to string them all together from a relationship perspective. So if I actually click down here, Power BI has this cool feature on the left-hand side. If you haven't looked at it too much, once you start to join and create what are called relationships inside of the view model, you can actually view them over here. It's a lot better than the one and how it looks like in SSRS. So we can actually see here that basically all those queries that I was just running over there, if you were to build a report all in one view pane and link them all together, this is what it would look like to bring all that data together to then create a condensed report of that information. So we can see here that we have collection membership. How do we relate collection membership down into client info? Okay, so like what collections is a client a member of if you wanted to filter a report against a collection? What compliance info do you care about? Well, you only care about compliance info for these specific clients, so you can filter back and forth between them. To update info, okay, so for these updates in this compliant information, retrieve this update info like article ID, title, things like that out of there. As well as then doing calculations based on that data to calculate what you actually want to end up displaying back. So what that all then gets turned into is a visualization that can then look like this, where you can look at it and say, well, show me what my compliance looks like based on the updates that are deployed, right? You could say, show me the updates based on this particular software update group instead. You could say, show me the updates based on the last, 90 days instead that are a member of a software update group. That way, if you had a software update group that had maybe more updates than in the past chunk of time, you could filter against that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Is this report one that we're working on making public, or?
Yeah, soon.
Yeah.
So
Okay,
this one,
cool.
I've got 2 more tabs to do, and a couple of little bugs to work out here. All the data set structure on the data model is done. This should be free and available to everybody. I'm hoping maybe end of this week, maybe next week, to make it available. But yeah, I've rebuilt this one from some other stuff that I had laying around.
So that pretty much wraps up. The goal of this video was really just to give you a deeper look at what happens on the server side, how the components are involved. So that's going to pretty much cover what we want to chat about. One thing to note, if you do have any potential topics that you want to see covered, feel free to leave a comment on the video, leave it on the post. Yeah, just anything you want to hear, make sure you let us know, because that is ultimately going to be what we base the videos on, or what people are actually interested in learning. So with that said, just want to thank you all for watching, and then if anyone wants to say anything on the way out, the video is up with everyone on it.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep, thanks.
Bye.